Nobody expected the documentary to unfold this way. At first glance, it seemed like another bold move from 50 Cent, a man who has built an empire on transforming real-life tension into cinematic storytelling. To the casual observer, it might have appeared as just another industry project, a flashy release to capitalize on curiosity and attention. But beneath the surface, something more intricate was occurring. Subtle patterns emerged, whispers circulated, reactions were cataloged, and then came the silence. A silence that fans immediately noticed, because in the world of hip-hop, nothing is ever truly silent. Suddenly, one name began trending alongside the documentary in a way that couldn't be ignored: T and Boosie Badazz. It wasn't a matter of public confrontation, nor a headline-grabbing feud. Instead, the tension existed in quieter, almost imperceptible layers, small jabs, fleeting comments, and subtle reactions that fans began interpreting as calculated. A single line, a smirk, or an offhanded remark can carry enormous weight in these spaces. And when fans start connecting these dots, the narrative takes on a life of its own. The first sparks of speculation came from old clips resurfacing. Moments that had seemed inconsequential years ago suddenly gained meaning under a new lens. Interviews, live performances, casual remarks, and cryptic social media posts were all revisited and reinterpreted. Fans asked, why now? Timing in hip-hop is rarely accidental, particularly when someone like 50 Cent is involved. He doesn't merely tell stories, he curates, frames, and amplifies them. Each documentary is carefully constructed to highlight tension, loyalty, betrayal, and ego, elements that sustain attention and provoke conversation. For viewers, this particular documentary suddenly appeared to contain more than just content. It suggested strategic commentary on industry dynamics. Fans speculated that certain artists were being cast in a subtly uncomfortable light, not through overt attacks, but through curated narrative emphasis. Were T and Boosie intentionally positioned against each other? Was the timing of these resurfaced moments coincidental, or was there deliberate intention behind how the footage was sequenced and presented? The questions spread across social media, creating a fertile ground for theories, alliances, and debate. Understanding why this speculation gained momentum requires knowing the histories of the key figures involved. 50 Cent, beyond his career as a chart-topping rapper, has transformed into a media architect. Over the past decade, he has navigated television production, executive producing gritty crime series, and building narratives around street stories that few other artists can match. He understands control over perception, control over timing, and control over the stories audiences consume. A documentary under his direction is rarely neutral. It is strategic and calculated, designed to provoke, illuminate, and sometimes unsettle. T, on the other hand, has long positioned himself as a Southern hip-hop elder statesman. Articulate, opinionated, and deeply involved in industry discourse, T has a track record of weighing in on controversies, both aligning with certain artists and openly challenging others. He has cultivated influence not merely through music, but through a reputation as a voice of experience and authority within the hip-hop community. Into this ecosystem enters Boosie Badazz, whose persona is unapologetic and blunt. Known for speaking candidly without concern for public approval or industry optics, Boosie represents a raw, unfiltered perspective in hip-hop. His commentary and interviews often make headlines precisely because he does not temper his words to suit conventional expectations. He embodies the kind of unpolished authenticity that contrasts sharply with strategic, image-conscious personas. Historically, T and Boosie have had public disagreements. Not explosive feuds, but philosophical clashes over loyalty, commentary, and the handling of sensitive situations. Boosie has openly criticized T in the past, particularly over statements related to legal matters involving other artists, and T has responded publicly. These exchanges, though they eventually cooled, left a trace in public memory, creating a backdrop that could be reignited under the right circumstances. When 50 Cent teased his documentary, fans immediately scanned for familiar names. The convergence of existing tension with the timing of the documentary release created fertile ground for speculation. Hip-hop documentaries, especially those crafted by 50 Cent, don't simply retell history, they reinterpret it. They spotlight particular narratives, frame moments in deliberate ways, and prioritize angles that will sustain engagement. Any resurfacing of old disagreements is instantly scrutinized. In this case, the reemergence of Boosie in relation to T and 50 Cent set the stage for a storm of anomalies. No verified proof exists that T directly influenced the documentary, nor that Boosie was intentionally targeted. But perception doesn't rely on confirmation, it thrives on possibility. When fans saw old clips and juxtaposed them with new context from the documentary, connections were drawn. Was the alignment coincidental or guided? 50 Cent's reputation for showcasing uncomfortable truths added fuel to the fire. If a documentary included moments casting individuals in a controversial light, audiences instinctively asked, who benefits, who is being framed, and why now? Adding another layer, 50 Cent and T share a complex history. Publicly respectful, historically competitive, both are influential leaders with strong personalities. Boosie and 50 Cent, conversely, have limited collaborative history. Fans began theorizing alliances and motivations not because of evidence, but because hip-hop thrives on narrative speculation, alliances, and reading between the lines. In the modern hip-hop documentary era, storytelling is inseparable from legacy control. Artists aim to preserve their perspective, shape context, and influence how history remembers them. With 50 Cent directing the narrative lens, the impact is amplified. Documentaries don't just inform, they frame. Framing determines memory, perception, and ultimately public conversation. Footage that was once contentious can, when spotlighted years later, appear deliberate. When fans began dissecting social media, old interviews, and live clips, the speculation snowballed. The rumor gained traction not because humiliating content was confirmed, but because existing tension already existed to ignite it. The psychological element is crucial. Audiences crave behind-the-scenes nuance. They are drawn to quiet, strategic moments more than overt public feuds. When tension feels orchestrated subtly, the engagement deepens. Fans become detectives, piecing together motives, interpreting timing, and theorizing about strategic alliances. The documentary, intentionally or not, became a case study in how modern hip-hop culture thrives on perception as much as reality. The resulting discussion is multifaceted. It's about perception of intent, timing, and control. It's about understanding how prominent figures manage image, navigate tension, and utilize media to their advantage. In this scenario, the documentary acted as a prism, refracting historical dynamics, revealing strategic undertones, and reigniting conversations long dormant. By resurfacing these narratives, 50 Cent created a platform where speculation, alliances, and fan interpretation could thrive, without a single direct confrontation occurring on camera. Ultimately, this documentary demonstrates the power of timing, curation, and historical context. It's a masterclass in how narrative framing shapes public perception, how subtle gestures can ignite global speculation, and how the intersections of influence, legacy, and strategy can transform a simple media project into a cultural phenomenon. Whether T, Boosie, or 50 Cent intended every interpretation is secondary. The impact lies in the conversations it has generated, the alliances imagined, and the narratives debated. In hip-hop, as in storytelling, timing, framing, and perception can be just as influential as action. As the internet continues to dissect every clip, tweet, and comment, one thing is clear. The documentary isn't just content, it's a conversation starter, a strategic lens on history, and a reminder that in hip-hop, the story is never truly finished. Timing is calculated, perception is everything, and legacy is the ultimate prize. Fans are not just witnessing a documentary, they are observing the deliberate intersection of power, influence, and narrative mastery. In the world of hip-hop, timing, perception, and subtlety often matter more than overt conflict. That's precisely what unfolded around the recent 50 Cent documentary. At first, it seemed like just another project from a man whose empire thrives on transforming real-life tension into compelling narratives. He isn't simply telling a story, he's curating it. He selects moments, frames them, and amplifies them in a way that few artists can match. What started as curiosity quickly became speculation. One name began trending alongside the documentary, Boosie Badass, not because of a headline feud or a public diss, but because subtle patterns emerged that suggested narrative direction and calculation. A line here, a clip resurfacing there, suddenly suggested that something deeper was happening. Fans began connecting dots, analyzing motives, and theorizing about the implications. In hip-hop, perception can be as powerful as reality. The story begins with old clips resurfacing. Interviews, social media posts, and candid moments from years prior were suddenly circulating again, framed in a new context. Boosie's unfiltered style, once celebrated for its authenticity, was now scrutinized for how it might appear within the documentary's lens. Audiences questioned, why now? What's the intent behind resurfacing these moments? And perhaps most importantly, who benefits? This is where the layers of strategy start to emerge. 50 Cent is no stranger to leveraging tension. He understands that controversy can generate attention, but calculated ambiguity sustains it. A loud diss track announces itself. A subtle narrative shift, on the other hand, invites discussion. When fans noticed clips of Boosie that seemed uncomfortable, speculation grew, not necessarily because anything had been done to humiliate him, but because perception drives conversation. The stage was set with three key figures in the mix: a media-savvy mogul controlling the documentary lens, an outspoken veteran with past philosophical clashes, and a blunt artist whose candid interviews have historically sparked headlines. Combine that with timing, history, and social media, and the story writes itself. Once old tension meets new media platforms, escalation becomes almost inevitable. The shift in perception occurred not through any confirmed act, but through collective interpretation. Fans began connecting the dots between 50 Cent's upcoming documentary and Boosie's resurfaced moments. Suddenly, clips of Boosie speaking passionately or defending his stance were being interpreted differently. Raw honesty was labeled reckless. Unfiltered commentary became a potential liability. That subtle framing shift ignited conflict because, in the digital age, context changes perception almost immediately. At this point, T re-enters the conversation. T and Boosie have a history of public disagreements, philosophical clashes over industry ethics, loyalty, and commentary. They didn't scream or stage battles, but their disagreements were noted, debated, and remembered. When old tension intersects with new content, fans naturally begin to speculate. Is T influencing the narrative? Is Boosie's past being reframed? Or are audiences merely stitching unrelated threads together? What makes this story compelling is the absence of verification. There is no confirmed private footage, no behind-the-scenes coordination. Yet, hip-hop thrives on perceived alliances. When influential figures appear aligned, even indirectly, the audience fills in the blanks. A single line in a promotional teaser about how public words can define you was enough to stoke speculation. No names, no explicit accusations, but fans immediately linked it to Boosie's history of headline-generating interviews. Suddenly, the documentary wasn't just about resurfaced clips, it was about consequence. In hip-hop, reputation is currency. If past statements are reframed, perceived intentions shift, and public sympathy realigns, a subtle alteration in legacy can occur. Fans debated philosophy as much as footage. Supporters of Boosie argued that his authenticity shouldn't be interpreted as recklessness, while others maintained that being real doesn't exempt anyone from critique. The conversation wasn't about humiliation, It was about positioning and control over narrative. Neither T nor Boosie addressed the rumors publicly, and silence became a strategic force. In hip-hop speculation, silence can feel louder than denial. When a story is clearly false, artists often shut it down. But ambiguity encourages patience, creates suspense, and allows the audience to project meaning. Meanwhile, 50 Cent did what he does best: tease, hint, and provoke. Cryptic captions, short promotional lines, and calculated timing kept fans engaged without ever making direct statements. This is the genius of speculation. It generates marketing without costing a dime. By allowing the audience to debate, theorize, and dissect, the tension benefits the project indirectly. Fan pages began producing side-by-side graphics of T, Boosie, and 50 Cent, often captioned with phrases like "who controls the narrative" and "legacy or liability." The discussion shifted from personal attack to narrative strategy. In the era of documentaries and legacy building, narrative control is the most valuable currency. From Boosie's perspective, this environment is uncomfortable, even if no malice exists. Old clips trending again, fan debates over whether he appeared reckless, and the realization that his name is attached to a project beyond his control all contribute to tension. When you don't control the edit, you don't control interpretation. Subtle tension can often be more consequential than a loud public feud. The moment of escalation came when a fan asked Boosie about the documentary during a live appearance. He didn't explode or accuse anyone, but his response suggested awareness. That single sentence carried weight. It implied recognition of the storytelling process, an acknowledgement that history can be presented from multiple angles. The mere act of speaking subtly amplified speculation, doubling engagement as fans dissected his words and debated their significance. The N. Narrative had shifted from curiosity to strategic positioning. The conversation wasn't merely about whether certain clips existed. It became a question of legacy and influence. Who would frame history? Whose version would dominate public memory? In hip-hop, legacy positioning is permanent. It becomes part of cultural memory. Every discussion about past moments, whether accurate or not, contributes to how audiences remember an artist. The stage was fully set for escalation. If the documentary included pointed moments, the narrative would explode. If it didn't, the speculation alone had created a masterclass in how uncertainty fuels engagement. Either way, the tension served its purpose. What started as casual rumor evolved into commentary on strategy, perception, and media literacy within hip-hop culture. At this point, the speculation extended beyond fans to include industry commentators and media pages. Analysts debated the intent behind the documentary, the possible motivations of T and 50 Cent, and the potential impact on Boosie's reputation. What was once gossip had become a study in audience psychology, media manipulation, and narrative power.
You might want to consider bringing in a crisis PR team, with many fans debating whether
every resurfaced clip became material for analysis. This scenario highlights the intersection of timing, historical context, and perception in modern hip-hop storytelling. 50 Cent doesn't just release content, he orchestrates engagement. T and Boosie's past disagreements provided context. Social media ensured rapid dissemination and debate. Fans, journalists, and commentators became participants in a shared narrative experiment. Even without
King of the
direct
South,
conflict,
artist Moneybagg
the
Yo,
ripple effect
also did interviews
demonstrated the
discussing
power
the
of
Miss
subtle
Jackson
narrative
record,
control.
explaining his perspective on how
Audiences were no longer passive consumers. They were active interpreters. They assessed intent, analyzed historical relationships, and speculated on alliances. Each micro-gesture or cryptic line was magnified through collective interpretation. A documentary that could have been a straightforward storytelling exercise instead became a case study in perception, influence, and cultural dynamics. The tension revealed how digital platforms amplify subtlety. In previous eras, disputes were resolved in interviews or music releases. Now, timing, editing, and narrative framing can provoke debate without a single overt confrontation. The documentary, intentionally or not, leveraged these dynamics. Each fan theory, each discussion thread, and each resurfaced clip became a part of the unfolding story. By reframing old content, highlighting particular moments, and leaving ambiguity, the project underscored the strategic dimension of modern hip-hop media. Audience perception drives engagement, and when perception is allowed to evolve organically, speculation fuels the narrative. The documentary exemplified this principle. The more ambiguous the situation, the more compelling the story. In effect, this isn't just a story about resurfaced interviews or potential embarrassment. It's about control of narrative, legacy, and perception. Who frames history controls cultural memory. This project illustrated that even subtle, indirect narrative
he suggested that T might face questions about reported legal allegations that have been discussed publicly,
The documentary became a lens through which audiences observed strategy, history, and influence operating simultaneously. The cumulative effect is remarkable. Old clips are revisited, historical disagreements are recontextualized, and speculation turns into public dialogue. Fans debate not only content but philosophy, authenticity versus image management, raw honesty versus calculated framing. These become the central themes. In this space, direct confrontation is almost secondary to the larger narrative of positioning and legacy control. Ultimately, the 50 Cent documentary demonstrates the power of subtlety, timing, and historical context in hip-hop media. By combining strategic ambiguity, curated historical content, and carefully managed promotional activity, it created an ecosystem where engagement thrives. The story shifted from gossip to positioning, from entertainment to cultural analysis, and from casual observation to active audience interpretation. This is a masterclass in perception management. Each clip, each tease, and each ambiguous line contributed to an ecosystem of discussion, speculation, and debate. The documentary itself became more than content. It became a living narrative experiment where fans, media, and artists intersected to co-create meaning. In conclusion, the unfolding scenario around Boosie, T, and 50 Cent illustrates the nuanced mechanics of modern hip-hop storytelling. Timing is everything. Narrative framing is crucial, and audience perception is the ultimate arbiter. The project shows that subtlety, strategy, and history can provoke far more engagement than overt confrontation ever could. In an era where documentaries can shape legacy, the quiet, calculated moves, like teasing context, resurfacing old clips, and allowing ambiguity to thrive, often wield more influence than loud public feuds. By the time fans had fully engaged, the documentary had already accomplished its goals. Conversation was sparked, speculation flourished, legacy dynamics were debated, and all without a single explicit accusation or confrontation. This isn't merely media consumption, it's participation in a multi-layered cultural dialogue where perception becomes reality, history is curated, and influence is exercised with precision. In modern hip-hop culture, timing, perception, and subtle narrative control can matter more than open conflict. This was precisely the case with 50 Cent's latest documentary. At first glance, it seemed like a standard industry project, a cinematic exploration of real-life tensions in the hip-hop world. But as the rollout progressed, it became clear that this was far from ordinary. From the very beginning, whispers began circulating. Fans started noticing connections, and speculation started building. One name began to trend alongside the project: Boosie Badazz. Not because of a direct feud or an explosive public statement, but because subtle narrative cues suggested that history might be framed in a new light. Fans and observers began dissecting old interviews, past social media posts, and resurfaced moments, asking why these specific clips were gaining attention now. In hip-hop, timing is rarely coincidental. 50 Cent has built an empire on understanding that perception drives conversation. He doesn't just tell stories, he curates them, selecting moments, framing them, and amplifying tension. A loud diss track announces itself immediately. A subtle shift in narrative, however, is calculated. It encourages speculation, debate, and ultimately engagement. The resurfacing of old clips featuring Boosie speaking candidly about controversial subjects highlighted this dynamic. Moments once praised as authenticity were now scrutinized under a different lens. Raw honesty became interpreted as recklessness. Unfiltered commentary became a potential liability. Audiences began to ask, why now? What is the intention behind resurfacing these moments? And most importantly, who benefits from this narrative framing? Layered into this dynamic is T, another influential figure in the conversation. T and Boosie have a history of public disagreements, philosophical clashes over loyalty, industry ethics, and commentary on controversial events. While their past interactions never erupted into explosive feuds, the tension was noted, discussed, and remembered by fans. Now, when a documentary teaser references loyalty and shifting narratives, the audience reads subtext. Subtext is where escalation thrives. The mere suggestion of alignment or strategic framing between 50 Cent and T, whether real or perceived, was enough to spark speculation. What made the scenario even more compelling is that there was no verified proof of secret alliances, no private material exchanged, and no confirmed orchestration. Yet the possibility of coordinated narrative influence generated enough tension to capture attention. Unlike social media posts that fade, tweets that get deleted, or fleeting moments on Instagram Live, a documentary is permanent. It sits in streaming libraries for years, becoming a reference point in cultural memory. For artists like Boosie, whose brand is rooted in unapologetic honesty, even the idea that their statements might be reframed can feel threatening. Legacy, after all, is serious business in hip-hop culture. The escalation intensified when promotional teasers dropped. One included a line about how public words can come back to define you, and another mentioned loyalty shifts when the cameras turn off. Neither named anyone directly, but fans immediately connected these lines to Boosie's history of outspoken interviews and the prior disagreements with T. Suddenly, speculation wasn't about content alone, it was about consequences. How might these clips shape public perception? How might they shift the understanding of past conflicts for younger audiences unfamiliar with the original context? Psychologically, the dynamics were fascinating. Fans began defending Boosie preemptively. His supporters emphasized that he had always spoken honestly and authentically. Anything else was a misinterpretation, not an attack. Critics, on the other hand, argued that public words carry weight and that context doesn't erase consequences. The debate transcended footage, entering the realm of accountability, philosophy, and ethics. The conversation wasn't just about clips. It became a discussion about legacy, perception, and the morality of narrative framing. Meanwhile, both T and Boosie maintained strategic silence. In hip-hop, silence can often speak louder than denial. When false narratives are obvious, artists typically shut them down immediately. Ambiguity, however, allows the audience to speculate, builds suspense, and maintains engagement. 50 Cent, true to his reputation, continued to tease the documentary through cryptic captions, short promotional lines, and carefully timed releases, never directly addressing any names. The result? Conversation continued to grow, fueled by curiosity, context, and interpretation. As speculation intensified, podcasts, fan pages, and social media threads began dissecting every nuance. Side-by-side comparisons of T, Boosie, and 50 Cent circulated with captions like "Who controls the narrative?" and "Legacy or liability?" The discussion shifted from potential humiliation to narrative control. In an era where documentaries can shape cultural memory, narrative framing becomes more important than the immediate controversy. Control the story, and you control perception. The documentary's power lay not in shocking revelations, but in interpretation. Old clips, when juxtaposed with new commentary, emotional beats, or contextual framing, can subtly shift public perception. For instance, Boosie's past statements, once celebrated as candid, now carry different weight when placed next to lines about consequences or loyalty. Even neutral editing can influence how audiences perceive tone and intent. 50 Cent understands this deeply. The documentary doesn't just inform, it frames, amplifies, and positions. Fan reactions exemplified the intensity of this dynamic. Boosie's supporters reposted clips with full context, preemptively guarding against selective editing. "Don't take 10 seconds out of a 30-minute conversation," one viral tweet read. Meanwhile, neutral observers began to ask bigger questions. Is hip-hop entering an era where storytelling through documentaries has replaced traditional diss tracks as the medium of conflict? Historically, rivalry was expressed through music. Now it could be shaped through narrative framing, editing, and controlled release. This represents a significant cultural shift. As the discussion broadened, industry commentators, brand managers, and cultural analysts joined the conversation. The narrative evolved from gossip into a study of media strategy, legacy, and influence. The documentary wasn't just about resurfacing old content. It was about shaping interpretation, guiding emotional response, and influencing memory. By highlighting certain clips, referencing loyalty, and allowing ambiguity, the project transformed speculation into a strategic engagement engine. Boosie's public appearances added another layer. When asked about the documentary during a live session, he didn't rant or accuse anyone but said, "I ain't worried about nobody telling stories. I lived mine." That line carried confidence, subtly neutralizing potential perceptions of humiliation. It also amplified the intrigue. Fans, commentators, and industry watchers interpreted every word, gesture, and silence as meaningful, further fueling the ongoing dialogue. Meanwhile, 50 Cent continued the promotional rollout without addressing any names. T remained publicly unbothered, adding to the intrigue. In the world of media, sometimes not reacting creates more speculation than reacting ever could. Every pause, every tease, and every ambiguous line became material for analysis, allowing the narrative to flourish organically. By this point, the conversation had outgrown rumor blogs. It moved into podcasts, Twitter Spaces, fan forums, and even marketing panels. When names like 50 Cent, T, and Boosie appear together in a narrative even speculatively, the attention isn't limited to fans. Industry insiders, brand strategists, and cultural commentators all engage. The question isn't simply whether humiliating footage exists. It becomes, what does this documentary represent? What does it say about storytelling, perception, and legacy control? Documentaries are inherently power plays. They don't merely capture culture. They preserve it, frame it, and influence how it is remembered. When 50 Cent produces something, it becomes part of the hip-hop archive, a timestamp and reference point that audiences will look back on for years. This permanence adds weight to every clip, line, and narrative choice. For artists like Boosie, whose brand thrives on authenticity, even the suggestion that past statements could be reframed feels significant. The broader discussion extended beyond immediate speculation. Fans debated not only footage but also the ethics of documentary storytelling. Was it fair to highlight controversial statements without providing updated context? Was this strategic editing, honest archiving, or something in between? These questions went to the heart of how modern hip-hop media operates, through framing, timing, and selective storytelling. Even neutral observers began analyzing the cultural implications. Is hip-hop entering a new era where artists compete through narrative control rather than musical conflict? If a documentary can influence perception, reshape interpretation, and guide audience emotion, it becomes as powerful as a hit record, or perhaps even more so. The stakes are high because documentaries leave lasting impressions. Unlike tweets or social media posts, they endure in streaming libraries, creating a permanent record that influences both current and future audiences. The result of all these factors, teasers, resurfaced clips, subtle framing, and strategic silence, was a multi-layered narrative ecosystem. Audiences were no longer passive consumers. They became active participants, interpreting meaning, debating implications, and speculating on intent. Each micro-gesture, each cryptic line, and each carefully placed clip contributed to a story that was co-created by the artist, the audience, and the media. By the time the documentary has even aired, the ripple effects were already in motion. Conversations had spread across fan communities, podcasts, marketing analyses, and social media platforms. Speculation became discussion, discussion became debate, and debate became cultural commentary. The documentary's influence was measurable even before its release, a testament to 50 Cent's understanding of narrative strategy, timing, and audience psychology. Ultimately, this scenario illustrates the modern mechanics of hip-hop media. Timing is crucial, framing is essential, and audience perception is paramount. By allowing ambiguity to thrive, strategically resurfacing old content, and leveraging historical tension, the documentary created a situation where speculation and interpretation became central to the story. Every moment, from cryptic teasers to public responses, played into a larger narrative about legacy, control, and perception. In conclusion, the unfolding dynamics surrounding 50 Cent, T, and Boosie Badazz showcase the power of subtlety and strategy in contemporary hip-hop storytelling. This isn't merely about resurfaced footage or potential embarrassment. It's about narrative control, cultural memory, and legacy positioning. By allowing audiences to speculate, interpret, and debate, the documentary transformed into a living experiment in perception, proving that sometimes the quiet moves, strategically placed, carefully framed, and contextually timed, can wield more influence than overt confrontation ever could. Even before the documentary hits streaming platforms, the story has already shaped cultural conversation. Fans, commentators, and insiders are engaged, speculating, defending, and critiquing. In this environment, every clip, line, and promotional teaser carries weight. Every moment of silence, every cryptic caption, and every ambiguous statement becomes part of the narrative architecture. The documentary isn't just content, it's strategy, it's perception, it's legacy. And that is precisely why this story feels bigger than a rumor. It feels like a chessboard. Every move, every pause, every subtle cue is calculated. Legacy is being defended, reputation is being framed, and influence is being asserted. In hip-hop, where stories are currency and perception is power, this documentary demonstrates that subtle, indirect moves can have as much or more impact than any public feud, diss track, or viral controversy. It's a masterclass in strategic storytelling, audience engagement, and narrative control. When 50 Cent released the full trailer, the intensity reached a new level. The trailer combined archival footage, industry commentary, and interviews with outspoken artists from multiple eras. The narrative was broader than fans anticipated, yet because speculation had already focused on Boosie, his appearances carried disproportionate weight. Every expression, every pause, and every clip was scrutinized. Perception was no longer neutral, it was primed. Fans and commentators interpreted every nuance, every edit, as deliberate, reinforcing the tension that had been carefully cultivated during the pre-release period. Crucially, the narrative was never truly about humiliation. It was about vulnerability. Documentaries inherently expose chapters that artists cannot control once they are archived. Even with fair and balanced editing, emotional weight lands differently when audiences expect conflict. Context shapes interpretation, and perception, once influenced, becomes part of the broader narrative architecture. T's composure, for example, removed fuel from the alliance theory, but it didn't erase the tension imagined by fans. Silence, in this case, carried its own meaning. The release also revealed another twist. The documentary framed moments as reflection rather than attack. Clips were contextualized, layered with commentary about growth, controversy, and consequences. The conversation shifted from gossip and speculation to a broader discussion about narrative ethics, legacy management, and perception. Some argued that the documentary was overhyped, and nobody had been humiliated. Others insisted the subtle framing conveyed meaning far beyond the surface. The debate, as it turned out, was about interpretation, not insult. From a strategic standpoint, 50 Cent's approach demonstrates an extraordinary understanding of audience psychology and cultural currency. By allowing ambiguity, teasing historical context, and using indirect narrative cues, he created a scenario where speculation itself drove engagement. The audience became complicit in shaping the narrative, filling in blanks, reading between lines, and debating intent. The project was interactive in an unspoken way. Every fan, commentator, and observer became a participant in the storytelling process. Moreover, the rollout illustrated a shift in how influence operates in hip-hop culture. Traditionally, conflict was expressed through music, diss tracks, or public callouts. Today, storytelling, documentary framing, and curated media releases can wield equal or even greater power. The medium is different, but the stakes remain. Legacy, public perception, and reputation are the ultimate currency, and 50 Cent demonstrated how to manipulate that currency with precision, without ever needing to escalate a traditional feud. Industry observers noticed as well. Marketing professionals highlighted the brilliance of the rollout as a case study in tension-driven promotion. Analysts pointed out how calculated silence, careful timing, and strategic ambiguity kept audiences engaged. Engagement, in this sense, is measurable not just in views but in discussion, debate, and cultural discourse. In modern media, conversation itself is a product of engagement, and the documentary successfully generated months of discussion even before its release. The cultural ramifications were profound. Podcasts, Twitter threads, Instagram commentary, and even marketing panels began discussing the implications of narrative framing. Fans dissected clips, speculated about alliances, and analyzed the intent behind every statement. The discussion extended beyond traditional fan communities, reaching brand managers, media strategists, and cultural critics. What began as a rumor about resurfaced interviews had grown into a broader conversation about storytelling, ethics, and audience manipulation. One of the most fascinating elements of this narrative was the interplay between expectation and reality. Audiences approached the documentary expecting conflict, ready to see someone humiliated or misrepresented. Instead, they encountered reflection, context, and layered storytelling. The framing allowed viewers to consider the broader narrative arc of growth, consequence, and legacy management rather than focusing solely on sensationalized drama. Yet the anticipation had already amplified emotional response. The narrative was no longer neutral. It had been shaped by months of pre-release speculation, subtle teases, and strategic positioning. Ultimately, the documentary serves as a masterclass in modern media dynamics. It demonstrates how perception can be shaped without overt confrontation, how legacy can be protected or challenged through framing, and how anticipation can transform audience psychology. The project illustrates that influence in hip-hop today extends far beyond music. Narrative, context, and interpretation have become critical forms of power. Artists and producers who understand these dynamics can engage audiences, manipulate perception, and shape cultural memory without ever needing to escalate.
He suggested that T might face questions about reported legal allegations that have been discussed publicly,
but the approach was subtle. Public composure, strategic silence, and precise messaging allowed each party to maintain control while simultaneously fueling the cultural conversation. Fans defended, analyzed, and debated, creating a participatory narrative ecosystem that elevated the documentary's impact before it even reached full release. In this scenario, attention became currency, and speculation became strategy. In conclusion, this rollout illustrates a new paradigm in hip-hop storytelling. It's no longer just about diss tracks, social media feuds, or headline-grabbing conflicts. Narrative framing, audience priming, and subtle media cues can be equally, if not more, impactful. By shaping perception, controlling subtext and leveraging historical context, a single documentary can influence legacy, drive engagement, and redefine how audiences interpret past events. The power isn't in the drama itself, it's in how the drama is perceived, interpreted, and discussed. The story around 50 Cent, T, and Boosie Badass reminds us that modern hip-hop operates as much in the realm of psychology and perception as it does in music. Legacy protection, narrative control, and audience expectation now define how stories are told and remembered. Every teaser, caption, and clip becomes a variable in a broader system of engagement. Every moment of composure, silence, or confidence sends signals to audiences that are just as powerful as a public statement or a viral track. And that ultimately is the genius of the rollout. By priming audiences, allowing speculation to flourish, and carefully curating narrative cues, the documentary became more than a project. It became an event, a cultural touchstone, and a demonstration of how power operates in the modern media landscape. Even before the full release, it had already reshaped discourse, amplified debate, and positioned legacy as the central battleground. The lesson is clear. In today's hip-hop ecosystem, perception is currency, ambiguity is power, and strategic narrative control can be as potent as any track or verse. 50 Cent's approach, intentionally or otherwise, leveraged all three with precision, demonstrating a level of media literacy and strategic foresight that extends far beyond traditional promotion. The conversation, anticipation, and interpretation surrounding the documentary became part of its impact, showing that in modern storytelling, influence often lies in the unseen, the subtle, and the psychologically calibrated.